Welcome to Engaging and Empowering School Libraries, a podcast that aims to raise the profile of school libraries by talking about topics that are current across education and teaching. Today, Darryl and I are continuing our monthly chat, FOSIL Education and School Libraries, where we hope to help you engage with the content on the FOSIL Group website, introduce you to people who are using FOSIL in schools, and most of all, just have a conversation about the role of school librarians within education. So thanks for joining me again, Darryl. I hope you're well.
Yes, very well. Thanks, and you, Elizabeth.
Good. So we talked last time about Douglas Knight's two major and unique functions of a library in our last podcast, and ended up by having a great discussion about the purpose and function of our non-fiction collections, and also about how to get started on this journey through the FOSIL Group website. So today, Darryl, can we start by thinking about some practical implications of viewing the library and librarian in Knight's terms? Can we start there?
So, if we just remind ourselves of the three things that we've touched on over the last two podcasts, is those two major and unique functions are that libraries are places where mind and idea meet. It's a meeting place for the minds of our students and ideas, and those ideas are contained in our collections, both nonfiction and fiction, but also physical and digital, which we can speak about a little bit later.
Yeah.
But the second thing is, and this is the crucial thing then, is that it's not just the meeting of mind and idea, but it's where those ideas can be developed and extended in the minds of our students.
Yeah.
And that really then is where this idea of the teacher being, the librarian being a teacher of whose subject is learning itself. So the collection is important because of what it contains,
Yeah.
the ideas that it contains, and our real concern then is that interaction between mind and idea in our students. And he then says that there's this vital collaboration between those who stir the mind to inquiry and those in the library who then teach the mind how to inquire. So just a reminder that that was 1968. And it was very interesting because I've got a publication, a school library, so UK School Library Association publication from 1972 called Libraries in Secondary Schools. And I find this quite interesting because that document says that the library has been described as having three main purposes: those of reference or enquiry with an E, study, and background or recreative reading. So those are the three functions of the library, or main purposes of the library. Now, the interesting thing is that enquiry with an E is basically the asking of a question. So the way that they define it is it's the asking of a question and the looking for an answer.
Right.
So that's why they say enquiry with an E is an act of reference. So you are looking for a specific answer to a question.
Okay.
But study, which is the second function, is where you then have one inquiry that leads to another inquiry that leads to another inquiry that leads to another inquiry.
Yeah.
And it's possible that that begins to look a lot more like inquiry the way we understand it. So not looking for a piece of information that answers a question, but building an understanding of something through a series of questions, and where we're looking for answers to those questions in the collection.
Okay.
And then, of course, the third function is background and recreative reading. So the interesting thing for me is that at a certain point so we were speaking about at a certain point in history, this is how libraries of all types were understood except that that was from the perspective of America.
Yeah.
But that is not too dissimilar from how libraries were understood in the UK at more or less the same time, 1972.
Yeah.
So I think an interesting question for us going forward is what happened, what has happened to our understanding of what the school library is and does, and the role of the school librarian in that.
So if we go back to what libraries potentially looked like in the 1960s, school libraries looked like in the 1960s, would we have had professionally qualified librarians in post?
So,
An expectation?
so I think so that is a project that I'm working on at the moment.
Okay.
Because it's quite, yeah, it's a little bit difficult to piece together exactly what the situation is. But I've got an older manual, again, a UK SLA manual called School Libraries, a Short Manual. And that was first published in 1947, and I've got the 1955 edition. And from what I've read so far of the 1955 manual, there is certainly language that the librarian is a teacher. Now, that may literally be the case. So there was a teacher who had a responsibility for the library.
Okay.
But it is certainly clear from those books, well, certainly the 1955 one, it's very clear that there was a strong push for those teachers who were librarians to learn how to become librarians.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, that is the situation in Canada, America, and Australia.
Yes.
Is
Yeah.
that
There
you're
they
a
have
teacher?
their teacher librarians. Yeah.
Yeah, so you're a teacher first,
Yeah.
who then becomes a librarian. It's a specialist teacher.
Yeah.
So that maybe is a conversation for a couple of podcasts away, when I've had an opportunity just to work my way a little bit through further. But I think it is worth just positioning that what we are talking about now is not without some kind of historical precedent for us, but that something must have happened to produce a very different situation. And I think gaining insight into that would be very important for us going forward as a profession.
Because we've almost come a full circle, haven't we? Because if that's the way they were talking about school librarians or school libraries in the 1950s and 60s, they did see it as a profession, whereas budgets, lack of understanding, maybe even the introduction of the internet has brought about a real change in the understanding of what a librarian in a school is actually about. And we've just sort of touched briefly, haven't we, on the fact that there's two skill sets really. One is the skill set of actually being the librarian. What do you need to know and do in order to be a librarian? But there's also that element of, you know, teaching inquiry skills and supporting the wider curriculum. And actually, you know, how it's just amazing how it's evolved so that we're now trying to push back up to that. We seem to be really at the bottom where there's a lack of understanding, where there's a lack of knowledge and training. But it's almost more imperative now than ever that school libraries and librarians come into their own, actually start making a noise about what it is that we can do and bring. I was just reading an article by Joshua Benton this week, which was called Asking People to do the research on fake news stories makes them more believable, not less. So a lot of people, the article was about the fact that lots of people, when asked to do the research, know about going beyond the current website that they're reading, but they don't have the skill set to take them away from what the algorithm wants to give them. So it keeps them in the bubble. It reinforces the fake news that they've been reading. And that really is down to the skill set of learning how to learn and understanding that you need to use specific keywords to get yourself away from that bubble. And it's almost like we've lost, like, I don't know anybody in a school currently that is specifically responsible for teaching those kind of research skills apart from the librarian. But if the librarian isn't taught how to teach those skills, we're almost in a vicious circle.
But you see, I think it needs to go one step further than that, because and this is where I'm very grateful to Barbara Stripling and the relationship that we have, because she has always been and is very clear about the librarian's collaboration with teaching staff is aimed at learning curricular content. It's not so that is our challenge. Our challenge is to figure out how to do that, because otherwise what we end up with is teachers are trying to teach content, and we are trying to teach one or more sets of skills that are divorced from the teaching and learning of content.
Absolutely. It has to be linked.
However, if we are becoming increasingly successful at collaborating with teachers on learning content through inquiry, then naturally and in age-appropriate ways, concerns with quality of the information that we're using, how we find that information, more importantly than that, what we do with the information, how we make sense of the information, how that helps us to understand what it is that we're studying, that then becomes a natural part of that learning process, and we aren't competing for time. And students and teachers are encountering those absolutely critical skills within a logical learning process. So it's a twofold thing. We need to understand what is going on, but we also need to be integrating that into our work on teaching the process of learning.
Which takes us back to that conversation last week about knowing your stock really well.
Yes. And what is very interesting about that, we ended, and I suggested maybe that we were looking at towards the end of, because I remember emailing you to say that obviously a 70% fiction, 30% non-fiction split is maybe more appropriate for sixth form. So by the time students are getting to the sixth form, I think it's entirely reasonable to expect that in school time, the majority of their reading ought to be, not exclusively, but ought to be focused on their studies. And that may be lower down. We were looking at more like 50-50.
But that's interesting though, because when we look at reading levels of fiction, it drops off at about year 9. So they should be, and I think, having looked at this previously, the reason that it drops off is because the reading that they're doing in school is more curriculum based. They don't have time to read the fiction in the way that they did in year 7 and 8. Maybe that's where the transition then comes to our non-fiction collections being greater at that age level then.
Yeah, so I think we need to understand that as a progression. So I think it would be wrong if we were saying that we aren't expecting or trying. And I think maybe also it's important that we have a shift in language, which is actually why the 1972 SLA Libraries in Schools document is interesting, because they refer to recreative reading.
Yeah.
So there's a kind of a reading for information and for learning, and there's a recreational kind of reading where I'm just enjoying reading in a different way. Well, I'm enjoying the reading in a way that is different to the enjoyment that comes out of reading for learning something about a specific topic.
Yeah. So at that point, talking about it in that context, it could be either.
Yes, so we aren't one, yeah, and so maybe if our language shifts a little bit there, so say for example in year 9, if we're using say for example the language of recreative reading, that could be fiction or non-fiction.
Yeah.
So if we have less of a hang up about whether they're reading fiction or not,
yeah.
Which is not to say that we shouldn't be encouraging them and be providing for them, but we do need to understand that given the time available during the school day and the access that we have to students year 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, maybe we ought to be more concerned about the so this idea of taking hold of and developing the ideas that we find, learning from those ideas, and that then ought to be reflected in the balance of the collection.
Yeah.
So year 9 does seem to be a point where we do need to begin thinking differently about our collection and what we are doing with our students around the collection. And it's curious because I still remember that reminded me, that conversation last week, of a defining moment for me as a school librarian. And I'm almost 100% sure that I can trace that back to when I stumbled into school librarianship kind of by accident in 2003.
Yeah.
And we had to prepare a budget. So I was curious. So what guidance is there on the collection?
Yeah.
And I'm almost 100% sure, and I know for a fact that at some point, the SLA guidance was something like, and I'm sure it was this 50-50 for primary, moving towards roughly 1/3, 2/3.
Right.
Non-fiction to fiction in secondary.
Yeah.
And I still remember thinking to myself, okay, so that has massive implications. If that's the recommendation, that has massive implications for the way I think about the collection. But I still remember thinking to myself, surely that also has to have implications for how I allocate my time.
Yeah.
So am I allocating 2/3 of my time to non-fiction related activities and 1/3 of my time for fiction?
Very interesting. Yeah.
Now, we've just done our budget, and the SLA bookstock guidance for 2024. So that's just come up, just been put out. And the guidance is primary school age range proportion of fiction to non-fiction is recommended as 50-50.
Yeah.
Secondary school range in the ratio of 65 to 75 non-fiction.
Wow.
To 25 to 35 fiction in order to offer one title per area of the national curriculum.
Wow.
Now, I'm as sure as I can be that that is the ratio that first got me thinking about the importance and the value of the nonfiction collection, as well as how I prioritize my time.
Yeah.
And actually, that leads very neatly into the fact that we were doing the budget and the development plan. I think the importance and the value of the practical importance and value of the IFLA School Library Guidelines.
Okay.
Because one of the things that is, one of the things that I did when we were doing the budget and the annual report was I wanted to revise our job descriptions based on what we were actually doing.
Yeah.
And I searched locally, but also internationally, for job descriptions that actually described the reality of what it was that we were doing.
Yeah.
And I was more or less disappointed.
Yeah.
And so many of the
that's basically, though, because the people writing job descriptions for school librarians are the senior leadership teams in schools who really don't understand what the role of the school librarian could be on the whole.
Yeah, and even what I found is job descriptions from schools in, for example, Australia, America, and Canada. Even where there is a recognition of the instructional role of the school librarian, they tend to read as a collection of things to do without any real sense of purpose and logic.
Yeah.
So what I did was I revisited the IFLA School Library Guidelines. So what I hadn't appreciated, even when the two of us worked on that SLA guide, what I hadn't fully realized when we were doing that is the logical structure, the logic of the structure of the guidelines.
Yeah.
So it starts with the mission and the purpose of the school library.
Yeah.
So if you aren't clear about who you are and what you do,
yeah,
none of what comes after that makes sense.
Yeah.
The second one then is what legal and financial frameworks does your particular school library operate in? So that is within your school, but there may also be regional, district, national considerations.
Yeah.
Human resources. So now the interesting thing here is, so there's a lot in the news at the moment, very positive news about the importance and value of a school library.
Yes.
And reminders that that library needs to be staffed.
Yeah.
And that is absolutely brilliant and to be applauded. But that immediately raises the question then of purpose.
Yeah.
So what is the school library and the librarian? What is it that they are going to do? And I think the thing that we have to be really careful of is that while having a library and having a librarian in a library is a very important and necessary step. What we can't afford to do is to not bear in mind that libraries need to be appropriately staffed for the size of the school.
Yeah.
So to give you a practical example, for a long time now, I have been using the Australian School Library Association recommended minimum information services staffing levels.
Right.
That they, the most recent version of that is 2020.
Right.
Now, what they do is for both primary and secondary, for number of children, they recommend number of teacher librarians and support staff hours.
Okay.
So to give you a practical example, for a school of our size now, so it's a little bit difficult. It's a little bit more complex for through schools because the ratios are slightly different for primary and secondary. But for a school of our size, so we are currently around 450. So the recommended minimum, which the IFLA guidelines also flag, according to a particular school's unique needs. So that recommendation is 2 teacher librarians. And I think they're effectively what you're talking about is a primary library and a secondary library. So 2 teacher librarians. And I think it's something, if I remember correctly, it was something like 60 support hours.
Okay.
Now, what we need to understand there is, so when I was working on the job description, this is where this became clearer to me. So the teacher librarian is a teacher who has specialized as a librarian, and they have primary responsibility for the instructional program.
Yes.
That support hours then can either be a professionally qualified librarian who are focused on the more traditional or conventional professional librarian duties.
Yeah.
They also have what they call a library technician. So somebody who is responsible for the growing IT component of school library work. Like, for example, LibGuides, issues with the catalog, technology in the library, all of that. And then a library assistant. So somebody who is focused on, the more day-to-day operational stuff.
So let's just get to the crux of that, though. That's not possible in most schools because currently we're lucky to have a person in the library working term time only.
Yes.
So that person working in the library is going to spend the majority of the time on the functional activities of a school library,
Yes.
So I was, we do obviously need to look at goals and visions to bring this important subject to light in a way that helps schools understand that actually the more understanding that they have of the professional role of the school librarian needs to be addressed. This isn't going to happen overnight, we know. But it really is important that we highlight these kind of numbers and something that we need to be working towards. Is that just by talking like we are today, or is there more to it?
Well, so I mean, I think it has to start by talking, because I think we will have scored an own goal. So if so it would be a huge achievement if every single school had a dedicated library space and a librarian. So that would be a huge achievement.
Yes.
But I think it would be an own goal if we weren't clear that that is a minimum.
Yes.
That we ought to be starting from that point.
But also that the librarian is not just admin staff.
Exactly.
That
So
actually the librarian needs to have a qualification and somebody that actually understands the wider role of the school librarian.
yes.
Yeah.
So that's why just to come back to the what really struck me about the logic of the guidelines, because remember the guidelines when they were written, you know, the guidelines are not the final word.
No,
They are aspirational and inspirational, and they point us in a direction.
absolutely.
But um, that's based on 50 years of research into effective school libraries.
Yeah.
So the logic is you have to be clear about the mission and the purpose.
Yes.
So this is who we are and what we do. In order to do that, we need to understand the legal and the financial framework.
Yeah.
Um, we need to be clear what level of staffing we need.
Yeah.
Then the physical and digital resources. So what does that physical and digital collection look like? And we've been talking about ratios and
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
but then it comes to the program and activities of the library.
Yeah.
So all of that stuff serves the program.
Yeah.
All of that stuff only exists for the program. And then the program becomes really important because that is who we are and what we do.
And what we're able to do because of the rest of it.
Exactly.
Yes.
But the danger is that if we aren't clear about what it is that we ought to be doing, then I think calls for increased staffing or resourcing are hollow.
Yeah, because if you're just saying, well, we need,
More,
we need, and without a purpose, everybody could do with more staff just
of course.
to do the practical things. But actually, the more staff needs to be for a very specific reason.
Yes.
Yeah.
And if we don't understand what that is, and if we aren't, so that's why, as I say, if I go back to 2003, that simple act of saying, well, actually, as we get closer to the end of school, the split between fiction and nonfiction ought to look more like this. Okay, so that makes sense because yes, year 7 and year 8 come to the library either once a week or every 2 weeks. I have quite a lot of contact with them. You know, the fiction collection is largely aimed at them because that is where there is input and whatever and whatever. However, what am I doing with the other? Yeah, so that is a percentage of my time. It's a
Yeah.
percentage of my collection. So what exactly is it then that I'm doing with my non-fiction time and
Yeah.
collection?
Yeah.
Um, so that then starts to become clear in the program because we can sum that up as literature and reading promotion.
Yeah.
I include media and information literacy within inquiry, technology integration, and CPD for teachers.
Yeah.
So in the very little time that I have had when I was working on my own,
Yeah.
of course, I didn't have the benefit then of the guidelines, which I only stumbled across in 2019.
Absolutely.
Um, So in the limited time that I have, and it's an impossible ask, but if I'm not trying to address these four things, then I end up largely with one, and the program becomes unbalanced. And then it makes it very difficult for me to have conversations with colleagues outside of the library about anything other than one aspect of a balanced program.
Yeah.
So we need to be clear that the library serves the program. What is the program? And then, as difficult as it is, we need to be trying to address all four aspects of the program. Because then the last bit of the guidelines are school library evaluation and public relations. So it's only because the program is resting on a solid foundation that it's able to do these things, and that is what allows me to advertise, to market, and to advocate for the program.
Yeah.
So there's a massive gap. A massive gap has opened up between, I think, in some sense, where we were, even if it was just having a clearer sense of purpose.
Yeah.
And how we did that. A massive gap has opened up between that and where we are now, to the extent that I think even just achieving a library in every school that is staffed is huge.
Yeah.
And yet, I think we have to be really careful that we don't allow the conversation to remain at that level, because that needs to be a crucial stepping point to understanding why staffing levels need to be appropriate for the size of the school if we are wanting to see effective school library programs.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's such a it's such an important topic, Darryl. And I'm going to bring the conversation to a close now because I think we've covered such a lot. What I do think we need to highlight is the IFLA School Library Guidelines are certainly something that anyone listening should be reading, and I will be putting the link in the show notes below. And really to think about, again, back to the last podcast that we did, you know, thinking about what your non-fiction collection looks like, and you know, we've highlighted that you should be doing more with it. You know, have a think about what it is that you are going to do. You know, do you know what's on your shelves? Do you engage with it? Do you find it interesting? Can you talk about it? And I think those kind of things are the things that are going to start librarians heading themselves in the right direction.
And also just one final thought there, if I can.
Yeah.
Are we as librarians and as a library profession creating the same kind of demand for non-fiction titles across the age range as we are for for fiction? Because I think, yeah, so I think that is just something to explore, is if we were more excited about non-fiction, maybe there would be a greater demand, and maybe non-fiction authors would be celebrated in the same way as, now I know they are different, they're two very different things, but I think if we were more excited about the non-fiction collection, that may stimulate a demand that would help us transform our relationship with the non-fiction collection.
Absolutely. And Do you know, that's just sort of reminded me what, since our last conversation, I've had a few conversations with librarians saying that there isn't the resources and the stock there for that younger age group, sort of lower secondary. But if we made more of an effort with what we're demanding or needing, then more is likely to be written. I have got a podcast coming out in the next couple of weeks, which is talking about nonfiction very specifically. So hopefully you will join me listening to that one. We hope you have listened and enjoyed what we've talked about today. As always, we'd like to hear your comments on anything that we've said. Please don't forget to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss out on future discussions. Thank you, as always, for listening.